in legacy media, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you can see this massive increase in words like racism and sexism and homophobia and all of these politically correct or woke terms. I find it very hard to believe that that was an accident. A lot of journalists are trust fund kids or people who come from money. They are promoting policies that harm the very people they claim to want to be helping. Violent crime increased across the country, and the primary victims of those violent crimes were poor, marginalized, dispossessed people. No one is ever going to be held accountable for what happened over the course of those 2.5 years when the Defund the Police movement took off and became fashionable. So some police arrived and placed me into foster care. First time I drank beer, I was 5. By 9, I was drinking tequila and then losing my adoptive father, losing contact with him.
What are luxury beliefs?
Luxury beliefs. This is a framework that I've developed over the last 4 or 5 years. Luxury beliefs are ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent, while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And we can get into specific examples and the sort of underlying sociological and psychological evidence for it. But that is the idea in a nutshell. And you see more and more people who wield social and cultural influence, high levels of income and education, and they are promoting policies that have detrimental effects that often backfire and harm the very people they claim to want to be helping.
Okay, let's then go into some of the examples.
Well, one example, perhaps the most intuitive example, would be defunding the police. This was a movement championed by prestige media, by many politicians, members of the cultural elite, from 2020 into 2021. And there were multiple surveys in the US asking representative samples of Americans, do you support defunding the police? And when you broke down the response by income category, the highest income Americans were the most supportive of defunding the police, and the lowest income Americans were the least supportive. And then even when you broke it down by political orientation, so if you just looked at Democrats, these surveys repeatedly found that white Democrats were by far the most supportive of defunding the police, and Black and Hispanic Democrats were the least supportive. And yet, in many cities, they did reduce police spending, cultivated this attitude of hostility toward law enforcement. And so a lot of police departments are having difficulty recruiting. A lot of officers retired or retired early. And from 2020 to 2022, violent crime increased across the country. And the primary victims of those violent crimes were poor, marginalized, dispossessed people, low-income people, Black and Hispanic people. And no one is ever going to be held accountable for what happened over the course of those 2.5 years when the Defund the Police movement took off and became fashionable among that sort of top 10% of American society.
So they could just go about having their fashionable beliefs and nobody ever says anything to them. They don't care. They don't even know that they've caused all kinds of trouble. Is queers for Palestine? I know it's slightly different because it's a bit a hypocrisy, I suppose, more than a luxury belief. But in a sense, if you were a queer in Palestine, that wouldn't be very good for you.
That's interesting. I don't know. I'd have to think more deeply about that. It does seem that at least, so the luxury beliefs idea has two components to it. Maybe this is the academic in me, but I gave it a very sort of narrow definition. Does it confer status on the affluent? Does it inflict costs on the lower classes? And if it meets those two criteria, then I would probably call it a luxury belief. In this case, the Queers for Palestine, they're disproportionately from college graduates, many of them elite university graduates. Does this inflict costs on marginalized, poor, dispossessed people? That one I'm not as certain about, but surely that movement is, people who are preoccupied with those kinds of movements tend to be very privileged.
Are there luxury beliefs on the right?
Yeah, there are a couple of luxury beliefs on the right. One that comes to mind is trickle-down economics. This is, among sort of educated conservative and libertarian types, this was an idea that was very popular. I think it still is to some extent, that if you just allow the wealthy to accrue more and more resources and don't tax them, that somehow those benefits will magically trickle down to the rest of society. I'm quite skeptical of that just because of the way power laws work, that in a free market system, gains naturally accrue to the top. And I think that there is space for corrective kinds of redistribution policies to help those at the bottom. I'm not opposed to financial assistance for the poor.
That's interesting. Okay. So, yeah, we're all obviously capable of having these luxury beliefs.
Mm.
were you maybe excited by how much the concept of luxury beliefs took off? Because that's like, I mean, you write about a lot of different things as well, but luxury beliefs like propelled you. Everyone wanted to talk to you. How's the last few years of that been?
It's been interesting. This is about 2 years ago. One of my readers notified me that Luxury Beliefs had its own Wikipedia page.
Ah.
I didn't have a Wikipedia page, but the idea did.
Luxuries,
And
but coined by some guy we don't know.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it said this. It's something like social commentator Rob Henderson, and didn't have the little hyperlink. It was just some guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it gave a little bit of information about it. But that was an interesting sort of like a moment of, when Wikipedia lists something, it becomes more sort of authentic or legitimate in the eyes of many people in the general public. That was an interesting moment for me. And then, more and more outlets have asked me to write about it and communicate what I think about that sociopolitical trend. Is it a luxury belief or not?
Mm-hmm.
And, on the one hand, I'm proud of it. If you're a thinker or a writer of any kind, you can produce thousands of pages of work over the course of your life, and you're lucky if you get remembered for one thing. And so, I'm happy that this, there are worse things to be remembered for.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm pretty proud of this idea that I've coined.
Who are some of the people who are like I mean, Chris Williamson's had you on a few times. Have you been Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, I've done Jordan Peterson's podcast twice. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I think people are probably watching going, okay, I need to coin a term and a concept. I've got to write, what can I do that's going to get picked up and get me into the stratosphere? It's really cool. Is there a sense with this that there is some kind of agenda, particularly looking at the woke version of luxury beliefs? Is there an agenda at the top, or is it just a bunch of people doing things without realizing they're doing things?
I think there's both. There are people who do tempt to set the agenda for what the educated public should be thinking about. Defund the police, to me, very obviously seemed like a coordinated movement among some circles, and then everyone else who reads prestige media, they just wanted to go along. They didn't want to look racist. They didn't want to look unkind or uncompassionate or something. There was a sort of a fervor in the country during that time, and in sort of the broader Western world. And so, maybe 1%, 5%, some small percentage of people wanted to promote and push this policy, this idea, denigrate law enforcement, and then everyone else just either passively went along with it or somehow fooled themselves into believing that this was the right cause. So I don't think most people who promote luxury beliefs are not duplicitous. They're not inherently hypocritical or malicious. But yeah, there is a small percentage of people who do believe that Western society is inherently corrupt, and that anything we can do to undermine it would be advantageous.
Have you been following how in the UK in particular, Keir Starmer, but also the newspapers on both sides of the political spectrum, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, have been rallying against social media, the alt sphere, whether that be alt-right or just alt, Elon Musk in particular.
Like independent media.
Yeah, independent media. And you use the word prestige media. Is that would that be the sort of
legacy media?
Legacy media. Yeah. These are the two sides right now. Are you across that?
I haven't followed that closely. I've just sort of scrolling Twitter or X that, there's been a little bit of a debate about this. It doesn't surprise me because a lot of these outlets are sort of mouthpieces for certain political advocacy groups and NGOs and organizations, and they would like for educated, smart people to get their news from those particular sources. And then when they hear about podcasts and Substacks and other things, YouTube channels, then they start to get worried.
I used to work at The Sun when I was 22, also, so 13 years ago. And yeah, I remember every meeting, every conversation was about, oh God, how can we keep up with the Daily Mail? How can we keep up with all the others and get a bigger share of the readers? And they must now be thinking that when they look at social media, it gets like 30% or so, and it's climbing higher and higher, right. And they're panicking. And that was worrying for me, seeing the collusion of a supposedly right-wing newspaper and a supposedly left-wing newspaper, The Guardian and Daily Mail. They're now together with the politicians. You rarely see that unless there's some sort of authoritarian government. You rarely see all three of those, the left, the right, the media, and the politicians together. And I wondered again if that's some kind of luxury belief, because a lot of the issues that social media is raising tend to be in favor of the working class, whereas the mainstream or the legacy or the prestige, they're looking at, you're all just far right, all of these working class people, and they seem to be in favor now of a lot of the woke views. What do you think of that?
That sounds right. I mean, you've probably seen some of these charts and graphs from Zach Goldberg and David Rosado. So these are researchers who've basically tracked certain keywords in legacy media, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you can see this spike from roughly 2010 to 2018, this massive increase in words like racism and sexism and homophobia and all of these politically correct or woke terms just sort of spiked during that period, during that roughly decade-long period. And it did seem like I find it very hard to believe that that was an accident, that, all of these terms at the same time, multiple newspapers and outlets at the same time, that this was just a total coincidence. And that was also the period when independent media started to attract large audiences, because people don't want to be beaten over the head with these politically correct concepts over and over. And so they started to seek news from other sources, independent sources, or at least get their opinion journalism from other sources. And a lot of those outlets have started to hemorrhage money. I know the New York Times financially, they seem to be doing quite well with their online subscriptions, but the Washington Post, this has been covered endlessly, that they've been losing money for a while. And other outlets too. It's very hard to make money in legacy media, as you probably know.
So is that a case of they focus so much on these luxury beliefs that they only have this sort of minority of smug people to buy their copy?
That seems right. That a lot of people are willing to incur financial costs in order to promote an agenda. I think this is where maybe a lot of people are mistaken, that that ultimately these organizations care about the bottom line. They just want to make money. That's true, but it's not as straightforward as many people think. I think that people who are in leadership positions at these organizations do care about the bottom line, but there are young, energetic, activist journalists who don't really think that much about economics. They don't think about finances. They have a mission, and they are willing to take pay cuts. They're willing to do whatever it takes. And also, I think for a lot of them, because a lot of journalists are trust fund kids or people who come from money, that's just not a concern for them. Money's not the issue. It's an agenda.
That makes them, I suppose, primed for ideological capture. I guess there's two sides of this, because you don't want to be someone who's a grifter who just wants money and you're writing articles for money. But if you're not concerned with that, then you're more liable to be captured ideologically, I suppose.
That's interesting. Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Gosh, one of the main issues at the moment is mass immigration. And I wonder, it's different. You're from the States, aren't you?
Yeah, from California.
Got a bit of a different mass immigration issue in these countries. Here it's centered around Islam, I think, a lot of the concern is that a good example of a luxury belief? Because a lot of people, you can explain it.
Is it? Yeah, I would say, especially illegal immigration, because it displaces the local workers. Legal immigration, I think, is more complex, because you could make the argument that when you have legal immigration, that those individuals bring energy and dynamism and ultimately help the societies that they're immigrating into. But when you have illegal immigration and people who are working under the table, who aren't paying taxes, who are undercutting the local workers, so if the minimum wage in your society is whatever, £9 an hour, £10 an hour, or $15 an hour in the US, and then you have someone who can work under the table for half or a third of that wage, then naturally people at the bottom, native citizens of those countries, are going to suffer, and they're not going to be able to obtain employment. So this does seem like a luxury belief, because who's benefiting from that? Who benefits from illegal immigration? It's wealthy corporations who can pay workers very low wages in order to keep their organizations especially profitable.
And middle-class people who then can get lower prices when they go shop at those corporations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Something Batya Ungar Sargon, do you know her? She did that Second Class or something was the name of her book.
Yeah.
She went around looking at the working class of America and found that they don't want this woke stuff. They just want to work and try and earn a living. What about when you do get like a white liberal, let's say, who is big on BLM and diversity? So I'm thinking of a Robin DiAngelo kind of person. Where is the self-interest for these people? Because on the face of it, it's just a white person who's supporting something that isn't in their interest. So where is the self-interest in this?
Well, it's interesting, because in a lot of progressive spaces, the hierarchies have been sort of inverted. And now the way that you can obtain status is essentially by calling out your own privilege, right? So it's not as if Robin DiAngelo has, she's essentially getting wealthy by talking about how privileged she is, which is a pretty nice racket, right? So you can just sort of tell people, oh, I'm a white person and I have to atone for this, that, and the other, and you as a white person do as well. But the white people that she's berating aren't earning money from book sales and workshops and public speaking gigs and so on. She is,
Mm.
and this happens. I've seen this at elite universities where white progressives will talk about how privileged they are, and they're not losing status when they talk about it. They gain it because by recognizing your own privilege, suddenly everyone else views you as a good person, as a humble, compassionate, understanding, empathic person. Whereas if you weren't to preface whatever remarks you're about to make with, "Oh, I'm so privileged, and I know I'm, this, that, and the other identity categories that I hold," um, then people will view you with hostility and suspicion. So there's this interesting sort of reversal.
Hmm. Since you started speaking about this last couple of years, have you changed your mind in any way, and also have you changed minds?
Hmm. Um, I have changed minds, not directly, um, but I have received emails from people. A lot of sort of fence sitting classical liberals or people who are centrist or moderate. Um, they read something that I've written or heard
Mm.
me on a podcast, and they did say that they started to question their own views or wondered how it was that they came to believe certain things. And then after the moment had passed and tempers had cooled, they suddenly recognized that how was I possibly supporting the idea of, say, defunding the police? And then they saw what happened, and then they realized, oh, I was getting caught up in this, and recognizing their own motives. Um, have I changed my mind about anything? Mm. I'm reluctant to say no, but I'm sure I must have. Nothing comes immediately to mind, but mm,
I don't want to
I
make you say you've changed your mind.
well, I guess like one thing that's changed. I don't know if this counts as like a fully mind changing moment, but I used to write in more sort of stark accusatory terms. I used to actually say things like, elites hold luxury beliefs in order to do X, Y, Z, as if this was deliberate and malicious and so on. But I've spoken to enough people, enough elites or quasi elites or people who are on that in that category, and I think most of them, at least they believe they're doing the right thing. They're not malicious. They're not trying to hurt anyone, but they just get caught up in these movements. They get swept up. And, once you're in a position where you're so comfortable and so far removed from the everyday concerns of ordinary citizens, it's easy to convince yourself that it's time to champion some newfangled, strange movement. But so that's one. But at the same time, I'm not that interested in the question of intent because the outcome is the same either way. It doesn't matter if some poor person in some marginalized neighborhood is getting harassed or bullied or killed, because of some policy that was promoted at the top. To that person, it doesn't matter whether it was intentional or not. And so as a result, I do think that we have an obligation. If you're a member of the elite or an affluent person who wields some kind of influence, that you have a duty to be thinking about, well, okay, here's this idea that I want to promote, this policy that I want to champion. You have to think clearly about potential second order consequences, unforeseen outcomes. If, will it make things better? Maybe, but at the very least, you shouldn't be promoting ideas that could make things worse.
Mm. I'm trying to think now whether intent matters.
Mm.
I'm just thinking because I suppose you could say it matters in terms of how we approach rectifying it. If people are deliberately just
Mm.
being selfish and elite and all of those things, maybe we
Mhm.
do need to, as you started doing, be more aggressive and say
Mm.
like, "Screw you, guys." Um, if it's coming out, if it's sort of a natural result of them trying to be righteous and good, then
Mm.
maybe we need to have more subtle ways of saying, "Hey, actually, I know you think you're doing good and you're a good person, but let's bring you down from that cultish ideology."
Hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, yeah. I think that's worth knowing. Yeah, that if it's being held maliciously, then you would adopt a different strategy than if it's sort of naivete. Yeah.
Mm. Tell us a bit, or tell me a bit. I know you've spoken about this, but your upbringing and background and how that shaped your views.
Well, I wrote this book that came out about 6 months ago called Troubled, a memoir of foster care family and social class. It's a memoir about my early life experiences. I grew up in foster homes in Los Angeles. I was born into poverty in Los Angeles. I never knew my father. My birth mother and I, for a time, we were homeless. We lived in a car. Um, eventually we settled in this slum apartment out in LA, and she was neglectful. She became very addicted to drugs, and some neighbors called the police. They saw what was going on. Um, And so some police arrived and placed me into foster care. And so my mother, she was my birth mother. She was from Seoul, from South Korea. And I grew up my whole life never knowing anything about my father. When I was placed into care, some forensic psychologists and social workers asked my mother, where's this boy's father? You're not in a position to care for him. Who else could care for him? And she said she didn't know who my father was. But a couple of years ago, I took this 23andMe
Mm.
genetic ancestry test. Just curious about that side of my family. I was working on my book too, and I thought maybe this would be an interesting tidbit to include. And I learned that my father was Mexican, so he was Hispanic, ancestry from Mexico and Spain. And I saw that on, I thought that would have been nice to know when I was applying for college. Yeah,
Actually, I heard you say that, and I remember
yeah,
I think it was on Michaela Peterson,
might have been,
and
yeah,
I was thinking, but okay, so is that the case now? And I think it is in the States that being Asian,
Mhm.
or as we'd in the UK say East Asian, would we say?
Maybe,
Because we say Asian for Indian or
yeah.
whatever, don't we? Is doesn't count for anything. If anything, is that against you?
That's right. Yeah, I think I don't even I must have put Asian or maybe mixed race because you can sometimes check two
Yeah,
categories.
you got to go with mixed race then,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Well,
That's what I do.
I don't think I remember in 2015 when I was applying, I had no sense or awareness of identity politics. I was in the
Ah,
military at that time, so I didn't even know that you were penalized for applying as an Asian person to elite universities. Um, but everything ended up working out fine. But that was an interesting revelation for me, learning about that side of my family because
mm,
it's I, my you know so anyway, I was in these foster homes. I lived in 7 homes over the course of about 5 years. I describe in detail what those homes were like in Los Angeles when I was growing up in the 90s in the book. And eventually I was adopted just shy of my 8th birthday by this working class family. So this was the Henderson family,
mm.
and we settled in a small, dusty, blue collar town in Northern California called Red Bluff. This is way, way up north in California. It's in one of the poorest counties in the state. My adoptive father was a truck driver. My adoptive mother was an assistant social worker. Neither of them were university graduates. It was a very working class town. Um, a lot of poverty, a lot of family fragmentation and divorce and addiction. Um, this is kind of like a snapshot of like California rural poverty. And so my adoptive parents, I was adopted at a strange point, I think, in American history, or maybe in sort of Western, in terms of like cultural patterns in Western history more broadly, which is by the late 90s, families in poor, like very poor communities had already been fragmenting for decades. But by the late 90s, even working class and lower middle class families, it was affecting them too. It was afflicting them. And so my adoptive parents divorced shortly after the adoption. And my adoptive father subsequently discontinued speaking with me. He was angry at my mother for leaving him. And so by this point, I was 9 years old, and my mother, she got custody of me, and we moved into this gloomy duplex in Red Bluff, kind of behind this gas station. And I just remember as a 9-year-old kid, after never knowing my father and then my being taken from my mother, all of the foster homes, I finally had this family. This was about a year and a half into the adoption. They split up, and then losing my adoptive father, losing contact with him. Um, and so in the book, I describe just how difficult this was for me and how, my mother at this point was working full time. She was doing her best to make ends meet as a single mother. Um, I had an adoptive sister, but she would spend, kind of every other week with her dad. And so I did what a lot of little boys do when they're unsupervised. I was 9, 10 years old by this point, and I hung out with other little troublemakers in the neighborhood, other boys who were raised by single moms or by, their grandmothers or an aunt or in other sort of family structures. I had none of my friends growing up were raised by both of their birth parents. It was very rare to see that in that town. And so, we would go and smoke weed, smoke cigarettes. I talk about in the book the first time I drank beer, I was 5.
Mm.
By 9, I was drinking tequila with my friends. We were smoking
Bloody
cigarettes,
hell.
smoking weed. Um, we would go to the gas station and pick up like cold medicine pills. And we, heard from someone's older cousin that if you take enough of these pills, you'll start to feel funny. And so we did that. This was by the mid 2000s. That was out. Like I think they instituted some kind of age restriction to purchase certain medications. But
Mm.
in the late 90s, you could get whatever you wanted as a little kid.
None of this
Yeah,
seems like the you that I know, because you're
yeah,
very formal. I mean, you've got a sense of humor, but
yeah.
formal, well dressed, eloquent, and at the same time, I feel like there is always something. There seems to be some through current from when we're like 5 years old or 7. I don't know when it sets in, but do you know what I mean? That you could meet someone you haven't seen since you were 7,
Hmm.
and something's still there.
Hmm.
Is there still something in you of that troublemaking side?
Probably. I thought about this in the context of my career as it took off during my PhD program. So I was very much not comfortable with what was happening in higher education. And I was just shocked at how cowardly people were. I always had this kind of rebellious impulse in me,
Hmm.
this feeling of, oh, if the authorities are saying one thing or if this is the dominant way people do things, then I want to sort of poke around and see what I can get away with. And so, I remember in 2019, I was in my first year of my PhD program at Cambridge, and Jordan Peterson was invited to be a guest research fellow on campus, and then he was disinvited. And, people were cheering and thought this was this great thing. And then I wrote an op-ed challenging the university's decision, and I defended Jordan. And, um, that was how I got on his radar, and how I met Michaela.
Was that the university newspaper?
No, this was in the New York Times, actually.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I had one contact there who was subsequently jettisoned after 2020. A lot of things
Okay.
happened in 2020, but he was an editor there. He's no longer there because of 2020. But
Wow.
he was a sensible person who allowed that op-ed to be run. Um, and so I do things like that, and often would court a little bit of controversy on campus. And there was more than one occasion when a professor would pull me aside when I was still a student and say, like, you got to be careful. You're right on the envelope. I don't know if you want a career in academia or not, but you are sort of pushing things. And if you keep going in this direction, it's going to be hard for you to find a career as a professor. And after enough of those conversations, and after seeing enough people get canceled and disinvited and mobbed, I just decided to go like fully independent and not pursue that career. So I think maybe there is sort of a through line between that sort of young, angry rebelliousness that I had as a kid
Mm.
to, my willingness to be a little bit more provocative than a lot of other sort of young, aspiring academics.
Yes, screw them. I've,
Yeah.
I've been thinking more about politeness and what politeness means, and how obviously having a bit of politeness is quite nice and helpful in many situations. But people who are very polite adhere so stringently to the societal norms of a particular place and time
Mm-hmm.
that they're scary, man. They're scary, those people. And so you need people like you who are just going to go, wait, hang on a minute, hang on, what gender did you say that person? Who's going in that toilet, or who's, defund the police? Is that a good idea? I was going to say, so your book and your story,
Mm-hmm.
it has echoes of J.D. Vance.
Mm-hmm.
And for those British people might not know, but he's the running mate of Trump now. I think he's sort of, I don't know if he's gone a bit different to how he seemed in the book. Anyway, I read his book years ago, and he didn't seem like the person I'm seeing now. He seemed a little bit more centered. Is that moderate? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But was he in his book in some an inspiration, or at least like a similar thing?
Yeah, I read Hillbilly LG my final year in undergrad, and um, I did see sort of traces and echoes of our stories. I knew naturally that once I started writing my book that people were going to draw those parallels. We both grew up in poverty in various states of chaos. He with his drug addicted mother and her various, um, you know, boyfriends and constantly moving and relocating. Eventually, he did find some stability with his grandparents, with his grandmother in the book, which he describes. But I never had that. I
Mhm.
was just in sort of foster homes and divorces and separations and reunifications and all the stuff that I get into in the book. And then from there, he joined the Marines. I joined the Air Force. Then he went off. Well, he went to Ohio State, then Yale Law School, whereas I went to Yale for undergrad and then Cambridge for my PhD. So there's a bit of, that trajectory. The broad strokes are similar, but um, one thing that I tried to do more in my book, I thought was really sort of get into the emotional. sort of subjective phenomenological state of a child or a teenager in those circumstances. I talk about my friends as well. One thing that I was worried about, because some people did this with JD's book and other books where they thought it was just this conventional bootstraps narrative of, well, here's this kid who had a really tough life and he worked really hard and turned everything around. And why can't other people do the same? Whereas with my book, I spent quite a bit of time focusing on the lives and outcomes of the friends that I grew up around and how their lives turned out, because that is the more common expected outcome of someone who grew up in that environment. I had two friends who went to prison. I had one friend who was shot to death, and my other friends who were working in kind of various kind of menial physical labor type of jobs, making ends meet, not living especially exciting lives, but they're doing okay. But that is those are like the options, right? It's like die, like get shot, go to prison, or sort of work minimum wage kinds of jobs. And then of the six of us, I had five close friends growing up. Of the six of us, I was the only one who went on to university, but that was only after joining the military for 8 years, where I learned how to actually become a self-sufficient adult. If I had gone on straight out of high school to university, I know that I would have failed out or potentially done something harmful to myself or to others. And all this being said, JD was really helpful to me when I was writing my book. I had a couple of conversations with him. He gave me some good writing advice, and yeah, I think his book did sort of maybe pave the way, indicating that there is an audience for this kind of story.
What do your old friends think of you now?
We don't talk that much about it. Every once in a while, one of them will text me, some friend from high school, and they'll say, "Hey, like you popped up on the YouTube algorithm on Jordan Peterson or something like that," and they'll say it's cool, but I don't like. I'll say, "Hey, that was cool that you saw that," but I try not to dwell on it too much, just because I don't want to underscore just how differently our lives have gone. I could imagine being in their position and not really. I think it would be hard to be friends with someone who's doing so much better than you and then reminds you of it. It's one thing you can be friends with someone and you sort of focus on commonality, shared histories, but when someone is constantly doing things that are unexpected, it can be hard to maintain a friendship that way.
They must think you're a snob or something.
Yeah. I mean, they probably do anyway at this point.
I got
But
friends.
I don't want to. I don't want to fuel it.
My best friend who did my wedding speech, the best man speech at my wedding. He came up on not stage but in front of everyone and opened my book, which are just which is nothing to do, and he pretended to read from it, and it was just he read out like the most arrogant stuff, just like I went down to spend time with these little people over there, and people were just cracking up, and I could tell in that laughter it was like, finally we got him, because they think I'm a snob or something, which I don't think I act like at all, but obviously I had to do a big fake smile for about an hour.
But uncomfortable.
But those are those friends. What about onto university then, having a completely different background, sharing dorms? This is Cambridge, sharing classrooms, people who have their own luxury beliefs.
Yeah. Well, my initial transition. So I left high school. I graduated at age 17, and then I joined the U.S. Air Force. 17 to 25. And that's another, you mentioned earlier just how different I am. Part of it was just because I spent 8 years in the military, and that will change anyone. And so by the time I was 25, then I went to Yale for undergrad. And that was when I first encountered people with luxury beliefs. I cite statistics in the book indicating that there are more students at Yale, more students from families in the top 1% of the income scale than the entire bottom 60%. It's just a massive dramatic change in terms of students who went to private boarding schools and had never once worried about money their whole lives, and so I entered campus sort of prepared for that I knew it's kind of a famous university, it's famous for students who are smart and rich and so on. I was not prepared to learn just how different the sort of social and family factors would be. I talk about how in the book I was in a classroom and the professor administered this anonymous survey to the class, and the question was, were you raised by both of your birth parents? And then the professor put the anonymous results up on a PowerPoint slide, and I was just shocked to find that it was something like 90% of the class had been raised by both of their birth parents. Because, I don't know what I would have guessed in advance, maybe 50%, 60%, because of the way that I had grown up. I'd known so many
Huh.
families that had been in various states of fragmentation and disarray. And then I would speak with students and, repeatedly, yeah, they were raised in a very sort of conventional, bourgeois family. And yet that was the first time that I had ever heard people champion this view that marriage was
Ah.
outdated, family, we should abandon these old concepts of the family. Every family structure is the same. Monogamy is this oppressive concept. And so it was the people who were the most likely to benefit from marriage and monogamy and commitment in these old family structures who were championing this view that we should abandon those ideas. And more than once, I had a conversation with a student who, they would say that monogamy was outdated, marriage is this oppressive force. I would ask them, well, how were you raised in
Mm.
your life? And they would say, oh, I was raised by two married parents. And then I would ask them, if you plan to have a family, how would you raise your children? What kind of family structure would you want to have? And they would always say, oh, I was raised this way with my mom and my dad in this family structure, and I'll probably do it for myself. But we do need to rethink how family is considered in society. Maybe we need to abandon it, or we need to evolve beyond it. And what I was hearing from these students, and you hear this from young graduates as well, that what I was hearing was I personally benefited from this age-old structure that allowed me to study at a place like Yale, and I plan to carry those benefits forward for my own children. But my official public stance is that people shouldn't do this. Like, don't do this thing that could potentially help you and your kids and achieve some upward mobility for your family. And I couldn't help but notice that duplicity. And at that time, I was also reading a lot of old school sociology and psychology papers and sort of slowly assembling this idea of luxury beliefs. But it did start with those kinds of interactions repeatedly. Students who had every possible advantage, and yet they were attempting to denigrate and erode the very attributes and habits that fueled their own success.
That's really interesting. That must have infuriated you. No, did that not drive you mad?
I mean, those conversations themselves, I tried to be objective and impartial and try to understand why they believe these things. There were a couple of occasions where I did get a little bit irritated. I mean, there was one story I tell in the book. I was at this party on campus, and I was talking to some young woman. So she herself was Asian American, and she said, she was describing her, like, oh, my mom was such a tiger mom, and
Tiger mum.
yeah, and she was so strict on me.
What's a
And
tiger mum?
a tiger mom is someone who's so this is like a an idea, I guess, in American society, or maybe Asian society as well. But Amy Chua, she was a Yale Law School professor. She wrote a book called Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. I think it came out in 2011. But this book sort of describes what a tiger mother is, of like an Asian American mother who basically drills her kids and prioritizes education and optimizes every decision in order to make sure that their kids
Okay.
accomplish and achieve and get into the best schools and do amazing, outstanding things. And so I'm talking to this young woman. She's saying her mom was a tiger mom and how stressful it was and how difficult her life was as a
Mm.
kid, and so on and so forth. And then she said, she notices that I'm, like mixed race Asian, and she says, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And I said, well, my mom, she was Korean, but that wasn't my childhood. I did not have that experience. And she said, oh, okay, so you didn't have a traumatic childhood. You know, and
Oh,
in her mind, what trauma was, being expected to go to a good school, making a parent making sure you did your homework, someone getting all up in your business. And I can understand that that could be upsetting to you,
a nuisance,
but this,
perhaps.
yeah, but the idea that that's trauma, or the
Yeah.
idea that, if someone didn't have that experience, then therefore they couldn't have experienced trauma. That to me was a little irritating, but I didn't bring it up with her.
Yeah, you tell that story like that now. At the time, you're like, "Oh yeah, well, let me tell you something, Mrs."
Yeah. No, what I actually enjoyed about those experiences, that I tried to keep that I didn't broadcast and advertise what my life was like.
Okay.
I enjoyed sort of flying under the radar, and
Mm.
because then students would be more honest.
Mhm.
Then I could collect these anecdotes without anyone sort of tiptoeing around me or walking on eggshells or thinking, oh, he had a difficult life, so I'm not going to talk to him about this and that and the other. It was nice for them to believe that I was among them and that therefore they could be more unfiltered.
Interesting. You were spying. You were collecting information.
Double agent,
I
yeah.
do that as a Jew sometimes. Don't let them know. I'm taller than most Jews are. They don't expect it. So I'm just like, oh yeah, what else do you think? Just
Oh,
get a few bits of information. I mean, see, this thing is though, then, and I
okay.
don't know if you experienced this. Then later they'll find out and they'll go, but you didn't say anything, and I'll be like, well, why I didn't need to, and they feel like they were betrayed by me not saying anything. And I can imagine a scenario where maybe someone was shouting at you about, oh, you can't possibly be
Yeah.
have had trauma,
Yeah.
and then when they find out about your life story.
So is the idea here that you don't tell non-Jews that you're Jewish, and
Yeah.
then they're more unfiltered about their,
Yeah.
stereotypes or what have you? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, I
yeah.
see. Interesting.
Although
Yeah.
now, actually, I do immediately because I just don't want to have that awkwardness where
Oh.
they've outed themselves as an anti-Semite, and now we have to be. I'd rather just not know, and we can just be friends.
Oh,
You
I
know,
see.
why do I need to
Yeah.
know this secret view they have? I don't need
Yeah.
everyone to not be anti-Semite. Who needs that? Everyone's got to not love Jews. I don't need that.
Okay. Okay.
Do you feel Mexican now? Was
Do I
that what
feel?
did that change how you feel?
It was so funny. I remember I was at Yale. This was before I took that test, and I didn't know that I was Mexican. I was in a dorm room with my friend who is Mexican, and he's like full-blooded. He grew up in a border town, really smart guy. And I took the sombrero off of his wall that he had, and I put it on my head. And he made this joke about like, "Hey, that's cultural appropriation. You got to be careful." But he wasn't being serious about it. He was just
Yeah.
messing around. And I go, "Oh yeah, my bad. I take it off." And then I got these results, and then the first thing I did was text him. And I'm like, "Hey, remember when you said I couldn't wear sombreros? Well, guess what?
I can wear half of
Yeah,
one.
yeah, I can. I can do. But I don't really feel. No, I don't feel any more Mexican. I don't really. I guess that's one of the things about. I've always felt just American.
Sure.
And even when I was growing up, I didn't even feel a deep attachment to my Asian identity. This was an interesting experience that I had, is just how much more preoccupied with race and gender and sexual orientation. Like they turned it into their whole personality. Sort of the higher up you go along the socioeconomic ladder. And so by the time I got to Yale, by the time I got to Cambridge, these students are setting up their Latinx societies or their Asian American clubs, and they just love being this thing and talking about it and indulging in it. And I just never had that impulse when I was growing up. And maybe that in itself, is that a luxury belief? I don't know, but it definitely does seem to be a class marker of just sort of being obsessed with your whatever category you belong to.
They would say it's a luxury belief, wouldn't they? But I think it just
Perhaps.
means you're a more interesting person. I
Hmm.
read this article. I think it's quite a famous article. Is his name Paul Graham? He's like I think he's like a billionaire or something.
Yeah.
But he wrote this article that I've been going on about recently. Who showed? I can't remember who showed it to me. Chris Ryan, tangentially speaking. Do you know Chris Ryan? Yeah, I think it was. Well, we'll have to take that out if it's not him. But he showed it to me, and he makes this great point. I thought of imagine a 30-year-old going off and living in all different kinds of countries. Maybe he does something like you've done, been in the military or done this or gone exploring and learned different languages, understood different cultures. And then if they come back and talk to an 18-year-old at university who's only ever known their home and their comforts and those kinds of things, their sort of their standard or maybe their Overton window for taboo would be really different, because the 30-year-old would be saying all sorts of things that the 18-year-old would feel really uncomfortable with. So I feel like you arrived at this place full of really sheltered people at universities, and you had so much life experience compared to these people. And so you found their things ridiculous, I suppose. And they must, I mean, if you were honest, they would have been really offended by the things you were thinking because it was outside of their experience.
That makes sense to me, and it makes me wonder if this is one reason why elite universities are more far gone ideologically than other universities. So, one of the things I noticed, so because I had friends, veterans, who also left the Air Force at the same time as me, and they went on to good state schools, Sacramento State or Ohio State, or just a solid sort of public university, and they would tell me, yeah, there are other veterans here, there are other older students, mothers and fathers and people who went back to university in their 40s, and it was just a more diverse array of people from all different backgrounds. But at elite universities, Yale and Cambridge and these kinds of schools, it's overwhelmingly 18-year-olds fresh out of private boarding school.
Hmm.
Right? That's still the case to this day. So when I got to Yale, there were a handful of us. I want to say maybe each cohort they take in, a little over 1,000 students, and maybe 15 of them are people like me who have sort of a little bit of adult life experience, who maybe dropped out at one point to run a company, but then came back to school, or decided to return after some time, joined the military, did something else. And 15 compared to 1,000 is just not enough to like actually move the needle in terms of
Hmm.
what students are thinking. I did make some friends, young undergraduate friends who were intrigued by me or who were interested in the things I had to say. Um, but yeah, in the aggregate, it's just not enough to really change the culture the way that you might see at these other universities. I mean, you saw this. There was an interesting graph from the Washington Monthly, sort of documenting the sort of protests, the pro Hamas Gaza protests across U.S. campuses, and the elite universities were the most likely to have encampments, the most likely to have run-ins with law enforcement. They were just the most sort of vehement around this issue, and the lower-ranking universities far less so.
Mm.
Yeah,
I
which I
wonder
found
if that's
interesting.
also about entitlement.
Hmm.
There's probably a little bit of entitlement. Like there are views out there that I don't like, and I'm used to getting my way all the time. So
Yeah.
I'm just going to set up camp and not let people come and get an education that's very important to those people and not really to me, because I'm always going to land on my feet. And then
Yes.
also that aspect of taboo, I think, because hey, let's talk about how Israel is a bit complicated, more complicated than you think. That's
Mm.
already that's like hitting their taboo
Mm.
button, and they're
Yeah.
going, can't handle it. Um, Thinking back to JD Vance again, I mean, a lot of moderates and centrists are put off, I think, of voting for Trump now because of him, because of the abortion stance. So I'm
Hmm.
just curious. I know you have nothing to do with JD Vance apart from somewhat similar backstory. What's your
Mhm.
view on abortion?
My view on abortion. I guess I'm very reluctantly pro-choice.
Hmm.
Yeah, but this partially this is just my immersion in evolutionary psychology, evolutionary anthropology. That's what I did my PhD in. And I just read over and over papers and ethnographic research into hunter-gatherer societies, and how, across the animal kingdom, infanticide is, it exists in different
Bloody hell.
forms.
Yeah. What a
And
dark thought.
I mean, it's just a fact, and including in sort of small scale traditional hunter-gatherer communities as well, when when women believe that having a child could potentially be a risky decision or what have you, like they're not always willing to care for every child that they give birth to. I am, very much against infanticide. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have abortion either, but we don't live in that world. And so, obviously I don't exactly know where the threshold or the cutoff would be. I feel like abortion at any time feels very wrong, but early on, it's yeah, I guess I'm just reluctant to say that the government should interfere with those kinds of decisions.
I think that's a very sensible answer.
Yeah.
I'll vote for you.
Fair enough.
Tell me about the happiness lottery.
Hmm. The Happiness Lottery was this Substack essay that I wrote, essentially questioning this idea that, what is it that we're optimizing for in our societies. We want everyone to achieve social mobility, we want everyone to go to college, we want everyone to get a high earning job. And my claim is that actually what we should be optimizing for is well-being, fulfillment, meaning. And that looks different for different kinds of people. There are different well springs of fulfillment. And yet the people who shape policy around social mobility and education, by and large, these were nerds who did really well in school, and they liked school, and they thought, well, if we can just twist the dials of society, maybe people will just love school and get more degrees and go on to get a white collar job, and that'll be their life. But I think there are other ways to achieve happiness as well. Providing for your family, being a pillar of your community, being respected by others. Um, and yet, I think our elites are reluctant to promote those old conventional values of integrity and punctuality and respect and law abidingness. Those are things that actually do predictably lead to
Hmm.
happiness. And yet we're focused on, other metrics of numbers of degrees that you have or graduation rates. And I think about my 5 close friends that I'd mentioned growing up, and I'm not entirely convinced that even if all 5 of them had the ideal upbringing, 2 married parents, great schools, well resourced, everything, I'm not convinced they would have gone on to university. Um, I was by far the most academically inclined
Mm.
in our friend group, and even I barely graduated. But I was the only one who read for pleasure. I was the only one who would practice the math exercises in the textbooks just for my own curiosity. They were not interested in any of that. They hated school. Um, and yet, when they graduated, what options were presented to them in terms of fulfillment? And, when you have complete freedom as an 18-year-old and you're not going off to college and you were raised in various forms of poverty and chaos, they would indulge in kind of hedonistic pursuits, and their lives reflected that. So, yeah, for me, the happiness lottery is it's a sort of a riff on Catherine Page Hardin's book, The Genetic Lottery,
Hmm.
that came out 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And she basically advocates this idea of kind of luck egalitarianism of you did not choose. Well, first, her book sort of describes convincingly and persuasively that a lot of the outcomes that lead to fulfillment, mostly education and money, those things are highly correlated with intelligence. And intelligence is not entirely, but largely based on your genetic endowment. Environment can help to shape it and what have you, but there's a genetic component to that. And so people who believe in luck egalitarianism essentially say that, well, you didn't get to choose the genes you were born with that led to your successful life. It's unfair that you got so much because you have these talents and attributes and so on, and therefore we should redistribute your earnings to those who weren't born with
Mm.
your genetic endowments. But to me, that argument overlooks the idea that maybe intelligence is heavily genetic and not very easily modifiable by environment or culture or education or what have you. But there are other traits that are easily modifiable by the environment, things like conscientiousness, like punctuality, respect, integrity, how willing you are to obey the law. um, Violent crime skyrocketed in 2020 to 2022, and that wasn't because our genes changed overnight. It was because the culture changed. It was because our attitude toward law enforcement changed. A lot of that was elite messaging being propagated through various organs and channels, and so people who are kind of on that boundary, who are maybe a little bit more criminally inclined, were suddenly given free reign
Mm.
to ruin their own lives and the lives of those around them. And so the happiness lottery is, some of us were maybe born with attributes that more reliably lead to happiness than others. And I think that if you have those attributes, you have a duty to find ways to make other people happy. And it's not as simple as simply cutting a check and making things free and just giving people more stuff. Um, that is not the only way to improve people's happiness, is just giving people more money. There are behaviors that lead to happiness as well.
So if you're happy, try to help others be happy.
That's one way to put it. I go into, so in that Substack post, I describe research indicating that, for example, being married, in terms of its effect on your happiness, being married is equivalent to earning an extra $100,000 a year. Um,
Which is ironic because
no.
the joke is typically that it's the opposite, you know?
Right, but it's true that married people tend to be happier than single people. And that's a large. So one way you could look at this is, if you're interested in government policy, how do we make people happy? Well, we could give everyone $100,000 a year, or we could promote marriage.
Mm.
Both of those two things would have the same kind of measurable impact on happiness. Um, Having a friend that you see on a regular basis, in terms of its effect on your happiness, is worth an additional $60,000 a year. And again, you want to make people happy, we could give everyone $60,000 a year from government coffers, or we could start promoting this idea of friendliness and neighborliness, and saying that it's important to cultivate your
Mm.
relationships and be a good, honest, trustworthy person, or someone who's worthy of being friends with. Um, and there are other uh, facts like this in that post, but essentially, religious attendance. So if you regularly attend a religious, if you go to church, something like that, if you do that once a week, in terms of its effect on happiness, that is the equivalent of going from the bottom quartile of the income distribution to the top quartile.
Wow.
And so, if you are a poor person who goes to church, who's married, who sees your neighbor on a regular basis, who has a friend, yeah, you can be just as happy as an upper middle class person who went to college and who is living an interesting and exciting life, who's earning six figures or more. And yet, so much of our discussion is around education and income and poverty and inequality, and not so much about marriage and friendliness and sociality and how do we repair our relationships.
Mm.
Um, and so, all of these ideas I tend to explore in that post. Yeah.
I interviewed once Dr. Marvin Chun at, I don't remember where he was at, but let's say it's Harvard.
He was at Yale for a while.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
Yale
Marvin
then.
Chun. Yeah.
With the mind reading stuff. Do you know about the mind reading stuff?
Remind me.
So he was one of the sort of pioneers of looking into how you can actually read into people's minds
Hmm.
with fMRI scanners.
Mhm.
And they did this amazing stuff. You can see YouTube videos where they actually show someone's dream. And it's a bit fuzzy. It's not
Okay.
great because you can only get to the sort of 1,000 neurons at a time or something with an fMRI, and you need to be able to get into like each individual neuron to be able to get a better picture. But it's pretty damn good. And I was looking into this for my book about secrets because it was, in the future we won't have secrets because people can read your mind. But he was making this point that I found quite scary, really. And I only mention it because it's to do with this sort of genetic lottery to an extent. He was saying a lot of people maybe didn't have the right upbringing or whatever it is to get into college or jobs and things like that. And in the future, employers will be able to scan your brain and go, okay, well, this guy's actually very hardworking and intelligent. He just didn't have the right opportunities and all those things. And I thought, I find that worrying because I think I like the idea of some sort of randomness that somebody could actually not be. Because what about the people who aren't genetically intelligent and didn't have the opportunity? And I like the idea of the plucky underdog who finds a little way and somehow gets his job and lands on his feet or her feet. Women have feet too. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what you think of that.
That is interesting. Yeah, and that is something that I actually discuss in my book. This idea that like that's all well and good. Like if we're good at identifying talented people, that's fine. But what about the untalented people?
Yeah. What do they do?
Yeah. Well, a lot of elite universities, what they do is they strip mine talented individuals out of their communities. So, if you're a smart 18-year-old kid and you grew up in some poor, impoverished part of the country and you managed to get into a place like Harvard or Stanford, so they, these places hoover all of these kids up, and then these kids aren't going to go back to where they grew up because once you have a degree from a name brand university, you're going to want to go out and explore and
London.
make the most of your, yeah, exactly. You go to a place like London, you'll go to a place like New York or San Francisco. Where can you maximize the output of having that kind of degree? Where can you make money? Where can you have an interesting social life? Where can you meet romantic partners? And so, by attempting to promote upward mobility in this way, I think in some ways it actually backfires, because what happens to those communities where those kids are taken out of, there's this sort of brain drain phenomenon where these communities continue to languish because their most ambitious and talented young people are sort of vacuumed out of those areas.
Like Good Will Hunting. Ben Affleck's character keeps saying to Matt Damon's a janitor, and then he's a genius, and he keeps saying, like, if I see you here tomorrow, or I don't want to see you here tomorrow, like when I open the door, I don't want you to be here anymore, that kind of thing. Because in movies, like, they don't have phones, so it's like if he's gone forever, and then that's it. And Ben Affleck's like, oh, he finally left, and he can be happy and all that. When in reality, it'd be like, where did you go, mate? Like, what, should we meet up? Next time. But anyway, I've got one more question for you. But first, tell me, where can people get your book?
Anywhere fine books are sold. You can get it on Amazon. It was published in the US by Simon & Schuster. It was published in the UK by Swift Press. Easy to find.
Okay. What's it called again?
Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. And I would also encourage people to check out my Substack as well, robkhenderson.com.
Who is a heretic you admire?
Oh, a heretic that I admire. Well, there's one heretic that I cite in my book, Charles Murray. I don't know if I would, I don't know, who's considered a heretic or not, but he's been canceled enough times that maybe he would count. But his body of work, he's one of the few living scholars whose entire body of work is worth reading. A lot of people would detest me for saying that, but it's true.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to look him up. People, please do go follow Rob Henderson on X and all of those things. Get his book, Troubled. It's going to be underneath and all the things, go and follow it. It's one of the best Substacks on Substack. Substack is a thing with writing and all that. That's what that is. Hit the like button and keep watching this channel.